The next one, the penultimate panel, is the role of cultural institutions in supporting migrant artists. So if I could ask them to come up to the stage. So this group is going to examine the responsibilities of cultural institutions, asking how we can create inclusive spaces, reduce barriers, and collaborate with migrant artists to foster representation and participation. So welcoming to the stage, and as the moderator, the former Sotheby's Deputy Chair for the Middle East, Roxane Zand. Roxane is an art advisor, author, and independent curator, an expert in Arab and Iranian art, who founded ZandFineArts in 2020 and also serves on a number of international boards. And joining her is Jonathan Burton, Chief Exec for Cockpit Studios, a charity and leading social enterprise, home to 180 artists and makers across its 2 sites in Bloomsbury and Deptford. And Andy Ash, Associate Professor at UCL, a multidisciplinary artist and President of the National Society for Education in Art and Design. And finally, the Director of the ICA just up the road, Bengi Ünsal. You're there? Are you there?
Right.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Sorry, I got missed.
Great.
Don't worry.
Well, thank you very much. Let me put this on. Right, can you hear me? Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers, Tima Jam, for her amazing initiative, and for all of you to be here. And then I'd like to move to, well, it's not there, but I was just wondering if anybody saw that image that was published in the art newspaper. Oh, it seems as if it might be there, because I thought it might be relevant to our discussion today, which is an image, yes, this one, a 42-meter high installation, or mural rather, by Dutch artist Judith de Leeuw, expressing her pain of what has happened to immigrants and migrants throughout the world. And this has had 34 million hits. So I think it's kind of relevant, also because the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France to the United States. And this is in Roubaix in France. So as an opener for our discussion, we can kind of muse on this a little bit. But I'd like to begin by asking a question. And thank you very much, Lucy, for your kind words about us. And thank you for this amazing panel, by the way. I feel really privileged to be sitting on the stage with the 3 colleagues here. So when we speak about artists on the move, the terms migrant and immigrant are often used interchangeably. Yet they imply different relationships to place, belonging, and cultural production. Migrants generally imply nomadic for work or status or safety or creative opportunities, whereas immigrants are a more stable and settled status. They live between cultures, and their relationship to their work is a little bit different. So what does this mean for the ways institutions support artists? And I think what I'd like to do is to turn to Bengi first. So Bengi, in the context that I've just described, you've worked in institutions across Istanbul and London and pioneered cross-genre approaches to programming. Do you see a distinction between migrant and immigrant artists influencing the kinds of supports that cultural institutions, particularly yours, should offer, or do you primarily focus on the work?
Thank you so much, Roxane. I mean, we definitely primarily focus on the work, and we do not actually look at an artist from, like, are they immigrants or are they migrants, but we look at it from, like, not to define them as an identity, we don't use those terms, but we kind of need to be super mindful of these terms and the distinction between them when we are trying to support those artists, because the needs are different. So we kind of ask the question, and we look at those when we are trying to determine how we give that support to them. So we just ask the question, what do you need? Like, because if it's a migrant artist, they might just need, actually I was talking to a gallery owner the other day who has migrant artists on their rosters. They might need anything from mental health support to a space to produce work, a space to enough funds to live, and because they are passing through, they might not have any friends, they might not know how the sector or like London works or any other place works, so they need support to also navigate that, I think. Whereas an immigrant artist, and I'm an immigrant myself now, they might need to find ways to have more belonging, as you said, in this arts world. And they might need maybe network in terms of getting to know people, and yeah, they want to just be part of the canvas of the London structure and the art world. So we basically look at it from that perspective. How can we support those artists, what they need in a meaningful way? Was there a second part of the question?
Well,
sorry.
No, actually you have pretty much answered that, because you have said exactly how you view the status. And it's actually a really great privilege to actually be with the three speakers, because each of them come with such diverse perspectives, and we're going to look at this question from very different angles. So I'd love to turn to Jonathan, who is involved in the world of making and crafts. If anybody's had a moment to look at Cockpit Studio and what it does, of course, I'm sure everyone's acquainted with the work of Cockwood as well as with ICA, but maybe you will say a few words about what Cockpit does, and also to tell us, in the craft and fine art sector, surely many of the makers and artists must come from international traditions or regional traditions, and how do you think institutions should navigate the difference between representing these imported traditions versus amplifying contemporary artists who are not permanently based somewhere? But please say a few words about Cockpit, because it may just be a little bit less known than ICA.
So Cockpit Studios, we've been running for nearly 40 years. We have studios in Bloomsbury and Deptford, and we support 180 makers across both sites. Studio space, but also business incubation services, one-to-one coaching, and exhibition opportunities. So we try to kind of give a whole rounded kind of support to what we, with the makers that we have. I think the sort of answer in terms of how we approach, how we kind of select the makers, I guess, for our space is makers apply. Yes, it's definitely international. We start very much, as Bengi's kind of alluded to, we start from a position of, creativity and skill as the starting point, but also a desire to kind of succeed professionally. And also to contribute to Cockpit as a community. So we look at kind of it in the round. We see that there's something helpful to having 100 people in a building learning from each other at different career stages, different ages, mentoring each other, as well as formal support. And the piece around, I guess, traditional practice or heritage practice versus contemporary, and I feel that there was something we were kind of touching on in some of the sessions this morning. It's an interesting one, particularly within craft. Heritage becomes a very loaded word. I think it's very loaded in the context of what we're talking about today. I think within the world of craft, that can mean something that's about intangible cultural heritage. It's about traditional craft that's very kind of geographically or culturally specific. And certainly at Cockpit, that's not kind of our main focus, but neither do we kind of exclude makers who come from a more traditional background in terms of their practice. Our focus is primarily around contemporary application. And I think we can see that where we're then looking to support makers to create sustainable businesses as well, we can see that there's a greater market there for makers working within the contemporary space.
Thank you. I mean, we'll come back to that because there's so much more to talk about support there for craftsmen. I'm going to turn over to Andy, who seems very distant at the moment.
Hello.
Both Andy obviously practices as an artist and an educator. How do you see migrant and immigrant identities shaping the pedagogical role of cultural institutions in supporting them?
So I'm gonna put my academic hat on, I think, first, and I might put the other ones on later. And I think one of the things that I think is really useful to think about here is the sort of origin of these words, the etymology of these two key terms, because I think it's important we understand where they've come from, and when we think about how they're perhaps used and how they've developed into what they mean. So the word, forgive me, my Latin is awful, but the origin of the word migrant comes from the Latin migrare, meaning to move from one place to another, to change one's residence, or to depart. It entered English through medieval French in the 16th century, and the early English meaning of the word migrant just referred to animals, birds, migrant birds. And only later was it extended metaphorically to people, to think about moving across regions and borders. And the Latin of immigrant, the Latin of migrant, was neutral. And I think this is why it's important to think about it. It was simply about movement, simply about the change of place. Over time, these words acquired layered meanings: economic, social, political, as human mobility became tied to ideas of labour, of borders, and of identity. And in modern sort of English, migrant still carries that sense of being in motion rather than settled. And you've implied, obviously, Roxane, that understanding. Whereas the word immigrant, by contrast, comes from also the Latin, but means to move into or to go to settle in. And that appeared around the 17th century in English and became widely used in the 1800s and 19th century because of what was happening in Europe. Industrialization, colonialization, things that were touched on earlier when others were grappling with this. So the 20th century understanding of immigrant refers specifically to people entering a nation state to live there permanently. And again, that's a neutral term when it first when it was first used, and it took on legal and emotional weight tied to border control, to citizenship, and to belonging. And we see this obviously in media today. So just in short, migrant, one who moves; immigrant, one who arrives and settles, both from neutral descriptors, but have become socially and politically charged terms that have shaped how we think presently about movement, belonging, and identity. And perhaps I'll come to the next bit in the other questions. Is that all right?
That's fantastic. Thank you. In fact, just before we came onto this platform, we were huddled in a green room where we were talking about some of these questions ourselves. And we mentioned that, for example, Ai Weiwei would be considered a migrant artist. He has huge mobility across the globe, whereas someone like Anish Kapoor, although equally well recognized globally, is more integrated and known as an English artist. So there are differences, even within the very well-known context between migrant and immigrant artists. I would love the audience to then talk about it and tell us what you think as well in due course. To go back to Bengi, in fact, I had in my mind some questions to be asking, but the discussion itself brings new and fresh territory to talk about. From your perspective, does this migrant and immigrant distinction play a big role? Or in your experience building multidisciplinary platforms, are there certain models you follow that enable artists from diverse backgrounds to be more visible than otherwise? How do you kind of cope with the distinction, or is there a distinction for you?
I think we don't move in that way of like, now we have to get some diasporic or immigrant artists on the program. We don't do it at all that way. But our program has quite a lot of migrant, immigrant, and diasporic artists on it, I think naturally. And the way it kind of presents itself is, and we will touch upon that later, but as well. But ICA is not a collecting institution, so it doesn't have that like after imperialism kind of collecting and presenting character to it. Our biggest asset is actually conversation, dialogue, and debate. And that kind of presents itself. In order for that to be inclusive, our artist needs to have that inclusivity. And what you said about like migrating like the birds, we actually value those birds or those people or those artists bringing things we don't actually know. And we want to learn from those practices. And I think maybe the migrant or immigrant artists, I feel, have more of a fluidity in terms of the way that their perspective, not only their perspective, but the way they present and perform their art as well. So for instance, we are, as an example, working with this group called Diasporas Now in a multi-year residency with them. And they are global majority artists from different backgrounds, living in the UK right now. And they are also performance, music, film. They don't have a specific, they are like this broad definition of artist, which we are as the ICA very much interested in. And we work with them not to just present them or host them, we work them to shape our programming as well. They give mentorship to younger artists, younger audiences. So our kind of, what we value, and we are just at the beginning of this. I'm not saying we've done it, we're amazing, nothing like that. We are learning, thanks to Diasporas Now, and thanks to all the artists that we're working with, and the audiences coming in, how to listen better, how to learn from them, and how to create that support and care system for those artists or our audiences. But they actually mentor young people with us at the moment, so they are part of the co-creation. And so collaboration isn't just a partnership, but they shape our program as we speak. So I think that's the kind of relationship we value, and we will be leaning more towards in the future as well.
Thank you. Fascinating, fascinating perspective, and we see more and more fluidity in many different ways, and maybe we come back to that in the art world these days as a result of a lot of transitions and transformations we see. But to go to Jonathan again, Jonathan, I think there's no other kind of sector in the art world where you see more blurring of boundaries than in the crafts, where the crafts are now described sometimes as the new fine arts. And where does the line stop between design, craft, fine art, and so on? But that's a whole discussion on its own. You represent and support the slow arts. And the slow arts has in itself a whole different implication in terms of what support may be needed. And you brought up the very important point about belonging and community. So do you find that because you operate on a smaller scale with slower arts, does that create a stronger sense of community? And are you able to give the kind of support that you think is needed? We hear very often from the University of the Arts London that a lot of young emerging artists have so much trouble getting into careers. How do you deal with this in your
It's a good question. I
work?
think just sort of overlapping a little bit with what Bengi was talking about. So we're, I think at the moment, 23% global majority, which within the craft world is not bad, but we could do better. I think we're keen to look at how we create pathways into craft. That starts and we've touched on it this morning in terms of young people, schools, further education, and then people finding their way to Cockpit and the support that we offer. So I do think that that's important. The broader piece about community, it's really interesting. I think the nature of kind of craft, you're right, you know, slow practice, people come and join us for a long period of time. We have some makers who've been with us for 30 years. Our awards and bursaries are 12 months to 36 months, so people come for a long time. And I think we see that the support that we offer is about creating kind of time and space for people to be able to actually develop their practice, and without kind of pressure to sell. They don't necessarily all have kind of retail contracts or gallery relationships. There's a moment where there's the space for them to be able to develop what they're doing. And then I think in terms of kind of formal support on our side, that sort of takes a number of kind of approaches. Formal workshops in terms of business development for makers and at different career stages, and one-to-one coaching. But I think it's also important, we were touching on kind of, you know, migrant mental health and kind of where we need to be agile and supportive in relation to that, and recognising where our responsibilities start and end. We have a duty of care. We look to support our community as a whole, but at the same time, we don't have kind of therapeutic skills. We would then at that point refer people, if we kind of refer a maker, if we felt that they would benefit from further support. And I think the nature of kind of craft is that it's quite intense. You know, there's just the nature of kind of an iterative process, something that's about, you know, extreme skill, repeating a process, creating kind of pieces, evolving kind of their practice. And actually, on the one hand, that can be great from a mental health point of view and quite meditative. And I think there are proven kind of benefits of craft in the mental health space. But at the same time, it can be kind of really tough. It can be quite lonely. And therefore, being part of a community of 180 makers is actually super important. There's always going to be someone in the studio next door to you who may have kind of faced a similar issue, whether that's on a personal level or whether that's a business level, or indeed kind of skills and practice. So I think we can see that there's value of bringing people together in that way, and working out where we intervene and where we can sort of lean back as well.
Thank you. So interesting. And in a way, it ties to something that Andy was talking about earlier, but also, by the way, in preparing for this panel, Andy sent me something wonderful, a chapter from a book. Maybe he can refer to the book himself. But in that particular article, there was a lot of reference to mental health and that sense of belonging. And, you know, I found that the article actually referred a lot to how immigrant and migrant artists cope. Well, not so much artists alone, just anybody copes with grief or bereavement or loss, and that museums can be a space in which you are given permission to safely relate to certain objects, or have a meditative space, or have the permission to feel your experience and your pain. So, Andy, please tell us a little bit about that sense of loss.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take off the academic hat now. I'm going to put the artist and educator hat on, because I see this is really important pedagogically for institutions. I see migrants and immigrants as identity, as shaping the pedagogical role of schools or museums and galleries, which is particularly evident in sort of urban contexts. And we talk about this in those education circles as the educational turn. And I would argue that schools and educational settings are not just places of instruction, but are spaces of belonging, as you quite rightly said. They're spaces of translation and creative negotiation. Again, you know, that idea of dialogue. Now, if we look at, you know, some of these settings, the Department for Education, the guidance they talk about with regard to framing inclusion and safeguarding, they see it as a legal and a moral imperative. Every child, regardless of their immigration status, has the right to education and must be welcomed without delay. Yet beyond the compliance, the challenge, there is opportunity, and that lies in how schools and education settings respond pedagogically and culturally. And I think each of those institutions, they all serve each school, each institution is different, and each school's community, and it reflects that community, and all of those audiences are quite different. Now, good practice to me, I think, and I'm getting to that point about what you were arguing there, is see, things that are trauma-informed or English and additional language. These are kind of responsive types of practice that begins with care. The creation of safe, consistent environments where difference is neither erased nor exoticized. Teachers and educators act as cultural mediators, making visible multiple ways of knowing and expressing. And when these sorts of organizations adapt inclusive policies, when they engage families and individuals in their own language, and they build whole kind of structure, schools around these cultures, and they value multilingualism and migration stories, they model empathy, adaptability, and creative thinking, qualities that are essential to both art and to education. And for many emerging artists, many of whom are themselves migrants or the children of migrants, such environments nurture the capacity to work between worlds, to translate, as you were saying, to hybridize, and to imagine otherwise. And I think art classrooms can be microcosms of the cultural encounter, where materials and perspectives intersect to form new types of narratives. And the pedagogical task then is not simply just to support migrant pupils and audiences, but to let their experiences reshape what and how we teach and engage, and to see them not as subjects of inclusion, but as co-creators, as you were saying, Bengi, co-creators of knowledge and culture. And in this sense, migrants expand the artistic and educational imagination. It compels these institutions to be creative communities that mirror the plural, the entangled worlds that these individuals, these pupils, these artists already inhabit. So that's why I think that idea of care, that's why I think that idea of thinking about how we engage is kind of key.
Thank you so much. And that actually brings me back to Bengi again, if I may, because I would like to refer to something, again, bearing in mind what Andy has just said, something that really caught my imagination, Bengi, whenever we've spoken to each other, which is that you see your collaborators as not invited guests, but as integral collaborators. So, and of course, that brings up the question of how you ensure that visibility and that collaboration in the long term and for the future. Do you see these hybrid identities as a strength, as a tool? How do you utilize that?
100%. We see them see that as a strength, definitely, although it has its challenges as well. Because especially everybody wants to define things. Starts with marketing and promotion as well. You need to define to bring people in, etc. And we are going against that and trying to undefine things. So it has its challenges as well. What was the first part of the question? Sorry, I totally lost my train.
I mean, if you could tell us a little bit about, these hybrid identities and how you use it as a tool and a vehicle, and how you see the future.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, the key challenge is sustainability, for sure. Like sometimes, unfortunately, how the funding system is also set up is the institutions may find themselves just doing programs for the sake of doing those programs, and including artists for the sake of just including them. And it's a moment, a flash on the pan, and it just goes away. What we are trying to do is exactly the opposite. We not want to just, as I said, host them, but we want them to change the way we program as well. So we are trying to do it as first of all, creating these residencies and making those collaborators the creators of those programs. So they come up with the brief, they set the rules, we announce together, we get the people in, but they kind of come up with what's going to be in that workshop, in that performance, etc. And we try to learn from that experience and from the people that also join us. That's how we're doing with diasporas now, right now. But also there's another thing that we are doing, which we call Youth Forum. So we are trying to ask the people, five young people we selected, mostly from an underprivileged background. We are trying to create pathways, like that's our main mission at the moment, to create pathways for people to enter the arts culture in the industry, not only as artists, but also as professionals as well, in any way they can. And we kind of make that education in brackets, because I think from our perspective, it's a two-way thing. It's not just one way. We are educating them. We are really trying to be educated and learn from them, and that's very crucial for us. And we ask them what art should be like, what institutions should be like in the future, and getting their answers and getting their feedback and trying to implement that to our governance as well. We're at the first stages of it. We're not there yet at all, but that is our kind of way of trying to implement this, and this migrant conscious work and practice into what we do. So yeah, the aim is to make it sustainable so that they come and they don't stay for us for a limited amount of time, but they, after some time, they also come back again, present something else, etc. If that...
Absolutely. You've really demonstrated how you go beyond the ticking of boxes. And this is a very important thing, because it's all too easy to fall into the trap of just saying, you've done X or Y, and moving on.
It might be because I am also an immigrant.
Yes.
It might be because I always felt that kind of need to belong. Felt that sometimes the language that I use is not as highbrow as some other colleagues are using. And I needed to kind of break through as well. So I appreciate very much like that, pushing those boundaries, breaking through, and try to, with empathy, give it back. So yeah, it might be because of... So I think it also proves how important a migrant's and immigrant's perspective is to the cultural landscape.
Absolutely. I mean, like you, I'm an immigrant. I'm a flying bird. So I completely understand what that means, and navigating one's space, one's identity, one's heritage. For me, in any case, has been an enriching experience, but I've been one of the lucky ones. There are others who find it much more difficult. So to come to you, actually, Jonathan, ticking boxes would seem to me like the last thing you would do, because it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not as familiar with the work of Cockpit as I should be, perhaps, which is that in your sector, in your crafts making and making world, the relationships may be very one-to-one or personal. Is that so? And does that make a difference to the kind of opportunities you offer the people who are in your system and your residents and so on?
Good question. I think we're all talking in different ways, I think, about kind of pathways into our organisations and what we do. And certainly at Cockpit, we're super conscious of kind of breaking down any barriers that there might be that would prevent someone becoming part of our community. Some of that's kind of straightforwardly financial, so it is about kind of fundraising for awards and bursaries and being able to support people so they either have a fully funded place or a subsidised place while they're with us. I'm sort of acutely conscious that kind of then when we don't box tick, certainly, but I think, and we see diversity as being at the heart of what we do as a community. We think that it's a really key strength. On all fronts, it's a way for people to succeed creatively. It does kind of reinforce our community. We've touched on empathy, I think, in terms of empathy, understanding people, understanding cultural difference, learning from each other, both in terms of your creative practice, but actually on a personal level is really essential. And then I suppose in terms of our support, it's a mix, because actually there's group learning in some of the things that we do when we formally bring groups of makers together to learn together. There is one-to-one coaching as well. And then I think organisationally, I then look for opportunities for people to meet informally. So it's very easy for people to be working in their studios in isolation. And actually what we then try to do as an organisation is to create moments in time that bring people together, actually, who otherwise wouldn't necessarily meet. They're not always in their studios 24/7, and therefore actually, it's trying to bring people together sometimes from quite different backgrounds and very different disciplines as well.
Well, I would like to now ask a question from all three of you, and we can just go from Andy to Bengi to Jonathan, which is, where do you see currently the biggest gaps? So, Andy, can I ask you, where are the gaps where the institutions are failing?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to pick up on a few things that Bengi said, because I think you're quite right that it's not just a story about movement. It's a way of knowing, which I think is kind of really important, and that's what the artists are able to do. They're able to translate between languages, between cultures, between systems of meaning, and I think that's really kind of interesting. Not all organisations, if you're asking for that question, not all organisations are able to operate in this way. I know the ICA does, and I'm a big fan of the ICA, because I think one of the things that I think these sorts of experiences, cultural institutions experiences, need to think about is the way that we carry some of this unique and embodied intelligence that comes with these artists and these ways of working. The one thing that I think it teaches is about adaptation, about resilience, and about imagination. And I think in art education we often talk about creativity in the form of freedom. But for many migrant and immigrant artists, creativity is also a form of survival. It's a mean of rebuilding identity and belonging in the aftermath, sometimes, of displacement. And when we listen to these practices, we begin to see that art itself can be a pedagogy of belonging, a way of learning how to live in more than one world at once. And I think that's something that's missed in some of our organisations. And I think what the ICA does really well is, as a cultural institution, it sort of moves us from thinking about that institution as an authority on culture to thinking about it as a space of encounter. A space, for me, where we encounter these things, I think is really important. And again, that's a gap for some kinds of institutions. It's not about teaching about migration. Institutes can learn with it. Learning from the uncertainty, the hybridity, the in-between spaces, I think sometimes they call it the third space, that migrant artists inhabit every day. And I've seen a lot of projects where institutions invite artists from the refugee or different sorts of backgrounds, not as subjects of representation, but as quite rightly saying, Benji, as co-creators, as mentors and meaning makers. And that, for me, is a kind of thing that I think a lot of places are not always picking up. It's almost like we have to see these institutions need re-educating these institutions. They need to think about how they transform some of these static collections that they have into living dialogues. They need to sort of remind us that the cultural heritage isn't a fixed entity. It's a continuous conversation. As you said, it's fluid. And for some of these emerging artists, navigating these sorts of mixed sort of identities as an approach, it's kind of vital. It blurs categories, they blur categories, they cross media, they cross languages, they cross traditions, they cross art, craft, design, etc. And that's teaching us through their practice that knowledge is migratory. That to learn is to move, to translate, to risk misunderstanding, and to begin again. And I think that strikes me as being something that's important institutionally to sort of flag. That fluidity, whether it's in the classrooms, in the studios, in the residencies, welcome the complexity rather than demand a coherence. That's difficult. That's hard. And that requires transformation. That requires a lot of care. And we were talking about the importance of caring for artists and the consideration to well-being. There's a lot of displaced things that go with that, but I'll stop there.
Lovely, thank you. You've summarized it beautifully. Bengi, where do you think are the gaps, and where can cultural institutions step in or sustain?
I think, other than looking at the gaps of the cultural institutions, first of all, I think the ecosystem needs more funding. Mm-hmm. So we definitely need more funding to be able to give the platform to more voices. And that sustainability also comes with the investment. So I think, first of all, what's missing is that part is hugely missing. I think the second, for the institutions or cultural institutions, I think something, the photograph that you put at the beginning, I think it was an important point, because I think we need more spaces that are brave enough to take a chance on artists that are talking about hard things and complex things. And I think there's more and more censorship. And so what's missing, and I really do believe we don't have that at all. We are quite bold and brave in that sense. But for more institutions to be open to that kind of debate and not running away from hard conversations and giving, really opening up to the difficult questions that these migrant, diasporic, and immigrant artists are bringing to the table. And I think another gap to me is in terms of governance with the institutions. So who makes the decision to program, platform, the way that we do those things? Who makes those decisions? I mean, I am making those decisions with my curatorial team right now, but also trying to find ways of, like I said, with Diasporas Now and ICA Creatives and our youth forum, to make it, make them be those co-creators and co-programmers and be really, really collaborating with us in terms of the output, the art that we present. But I think that question is also important, because there is kind of, it's a very privileged and from a certain background and very used to kind of way of presenting, curating art in institutions right now, and decision making. Mm-hmm. So basically telling the story of others from a sometimes Orientalist way of telling those. So how can we make sure that those conversations, how can we turn that around, and how can we make it really the narrative and the decision of those artists that we claim to represent? I think that's an important gap, in my view, that we are trying to bridge at the moment.
Thank you, thank you. And now, Jonathan.
I guess just sort of looking at it quite broadly, I think the gaps that I can see at the moment, certainly that kind of impact Cockpit and the craft and making sector, the things that we've touched on this morning, just in terms of people having access within formal education to creative subjects, and particularly around making, is something that's really essential and live now, and that no matter how hard we try as institutions and organisations to fill that gap, we can't do it. We can't do it all. Bengi's point around kind of, money and scale is also important. I think with my Cockpit hat on, I can kind of, we have, I think, 8 applications for every kind of place that we have. So the demand is there. There are people doing extraordinary kind of work, and we need the space to be able to do that. And then I guess at the other end, there's a piece around, market and market development, and I think within the craft and making sector, the ecosystem for sales is smaller in some ways than fine art. It's less developed than fine art. I hasten to add that I hate these definitions between different categories. I tend to kind of see a very porous relationship between fine art, craft, design, art. So I think, but I think that the market development piece is important, and that makers are incredibly they're clever in terms of thinking about how they get their work out there, whether that's retail or galleries or direct sales. And we work very closely with them to try and facilitate that and create new opportunities. But ultimately, that's definitely work in progress.
Thank you. I think 3 really important and different perspectives here. And we're coming to a point where I think we could open the floor to some questions. But before we do, I'd love to thank all the perspectives here, from the mental health issue you brought up, Andy, to the phrase you used, knowledge is migratory. That's really, really key. Bengi mentioning about funding, which of course, we all live by the numbers in many ways, and also telling the narrative authentically, which is what you've pointed to. And of course, when it comes to the slow arts, I'm sorry, I keep saying slow arts, but maybe it's completely the wrong term. It's market development opportunities, the space to be able to work and to develop the ecosystem for these makers. When I was very kindly asked by Tima to talk about cultural institutions in this context, I was preparing myself for conversations about institutions as post-imperialist spaces, and how do we unpick aesthetics of, post-colonial conversations and all of this kind of thing. And actually, I find that, of course, we're not here talking about collecting institutions, it's slightly different, but I find that actually all 3 people who are involved so heavily in these initiatives are highly sensitive, detail-oriented, personal, engaged, and articulate individuals. And I don't say this to flatter the panel, but I just genuinely get this in speaking to them. And I think that's a very promising thing for this question going forward. So I think we've just basically summarized that cultural institutions are increasingly more than just venues. They're active partners in newcomers' integration by offering access, co-production, skills, and pathways into careers. And we're at a moment where the institutions have to act as bridges, combining programming with institutional change, advocacy, rights, opportunities, and so on. So on that note, without becoming too kind of verbose, I'd love to ask if anybody has a question in the audience. And please do ask questions rather than commentaries. Anybody? Please. Sorry, could you, I'm so sorry, I think you'll get a microphone, or you might need to shout.
Hi, thank you for the panel. You talked a lot about your role and the way that you can integrate and support migrant artists. I wonder if you could expand a bit more about how the art can be used to help the conversation about migration in general, and how that can work on a societal level, not just within the support for the artists and the work that they're making within that context, but how that influences the conversations we have generally and the attitude towards migrants and migration.
Maybe Bengi?
I think you should tell me how it how it reaches you. I think like all art is there to kind of inspire and create that. As long as we can present it, I think it's bound to change it. And maybe the change is slow, but it's definitely happening. But I think it, again, connects to that bravery in terms of creating that space for those artists and topics. Otherwise, it's not going to go anywhere. And then I think amplification is much needed. There's so much we can do as an arts institution or the artist, but then the support of the audiences, the support of the press, etc., is needed to turn it into something that is being talked about. Is that what you asked, or is there another dimension to it?
No, I think that's it. I'm a curator, and I recently worked on a project where one of the each season we take a different theme, and one of the themes was "No, but where are you really from?" asking artists to respond to that and putting the work out in the public realm. And that is all about inspiring conversations. So it's more about your experiences of that, how you find people respond to it. I think it's really key that art is there to continue inspiring and encouraging conversations. As you say, it's about the bravery and the freedom that we have to create those platforms to force conversations that are also sometimes more nuanced than the conversations that are being allowed in other contexts. And I say allowed because it's really about the control of what comes out of state rhetoric or what the media chooses to print, as you say, PR, etc.
Yeah, I think we need to make it as big as possible. I think community becomes super important then, and now most of the artists are working in communities, and that makes their voice even heard louder. I mean, just to give you an example, like times are unfortunately changing really slowly. 40 years ago, the ICA did an exhibition called Thin Black Lines, and Lubena Hamid curated it. We did it again in a different way, in a more fluid way, with 15 events, etc. this year on the 40th year, called Connect and Think Black Lines, with the title. And when I was talking to Lubena, and Lubena was talking to the audiences and artists, etc., she said, we wanted to be seen in an institution, so I went and pitched this idea, got only a corridor from the ICA. That was it back then. And we thought that this would break us into the institutions, and we would have made it, and we would just have our own exhibitions, we would be known. It has taken us so much time, she said. Like, it's kind of a disgrace, in a way, to all of us, including the ICA, to first of all give them only the corridor as a tick-boxing exercise, maybe, and then not following up, not creating that sustainability. So I think it's also up to us to be that, like, flag bearers and just not just do it, but consistently and continuously talk about it and make sure that it just is kind of viral and goes to other institutions, etc. And this doesn't happen again. I mean, yeah, I hope so. But I think Jonathan wants to say something.
It won't be as eloquent as that. I think from Cockpit's point of view, I would say that it's very much kind of community kind of focused as well. There's an overlap. Thinking about Alice's work earlier and artists, makers going out into the community, working with young people, but people of all ages and all backgrounds, particularly down in Deptford. We've done a lot of work in that space, but not alone, obviously, as an organisation in doing that. But I think it's interesting, you know, our space down at Deptford, we have a public art piece on our outside wall of our craft garden down in Deptford called Head, Heart, Hands. And the whole development of that was led by one of our makers, but then working across the community, schools and community groups in Deptford. And what's, I think, notable with it and relevant kind of today is that it features Head, Heart, Hands in 40 different languages, the 40 different languages that are spoken in Deptford. And I think there's a moment of that kind of on-the-ground activity as a way of kind of shifting opinion and perspectives.
Any other questions?
Hi. Sorry. I was wondering if I could ask a question about kind of urgency with regards dealing with the kind of current socio-political climate that we find ourselves in. Obviously, there's a lot of abhorrent rhetoric at the moment around who people define as migrants, and all this horrible talk about small boats and things. And obviously that we're seeing that really high stakes, life and death potential across the country. I know that you all work for London institutions, but I suppose I'm wondering, what can the institution do, maybe as more widely, asking you three as experts and great minds, what can the cultural institution do to help us in this moment of crisis, I suppose, in the country? I just felt like this probably should be mentioned in a day talking about migration, this kind of current situation that we find ourselves in.
Actually, I'd love to ask maybe Andy to respond to that.
Thank you. I'm not. It's a myth. I think the first thing I'd say is that there are some really important institutions out there that have been doing this work for a very long time. And I think that needs to be sort of celebrated. Places like Innova, places like Autograph, places like the October Gallery, that for 40-odd years have been thinking about the global majority and bringing these people to the city. So I think that's the first thing, that this isn't something that's not happening, and isn't something that's not been happening for a very long time. So I think that's the first thing I would say. I think you're right about the importance of challenging some of these cultural institutions and to get them to think about how they operate differently. To become less about their own authority and more about hosting plurality, developing agency, again, as you were talking about, co-learning, thinking about caring spaces and sharing authorship, sharing the curation. These are sort of the pedagogical turn that I mentioned earlier. This idea of the dialogic, the creative process of world making. That to me sort of is really key in how we go forward. Our future is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. But what we do know is that to react, we need to be more fluid. We need to think about more entangled realities of the global present. And how we engage with that is going to be crucial to how we become.
Wonderful. Well, becoming is the theme of the Qatar Art Basel edition in February, so we look forward maybe to some answers there. But thank you. You have actually raised a few really interesting points, Andy. Yes, please, the gentleman.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Roxane, Andy, Bengi, and Jonathan. I knew you were Turkish just because of the dot on your name, so I was actually quite excited to hear from you. I'm a filmmaker, so my art is filmmaking. I also do sculpture and oil on canvas and poetry. One of the things that artists do is command attention, if the work is correct and a work of beauty in any way, shape, and form. Again, like the lady mentioned earlier, we are in turbulent times. More than for the people, for the word migrant, immigrant. The word migrant and immigrant changes shape and color depending on where a person is from. They become an expat if they are from more affluent countries. So they're known as expat artists. Immediately, they command respect. So my question is, and I'm sure you answered this quite a bit earlier, but more nuanced in the sense of changing vocabulary and the meaning of changing vocabulary. Whenever you say the word migrant, volatile times, everywhere in the world, you look at them as the scapegoats, the people that are causing the problems. So what can art and artists do to change and elevate the word migrant, or perhaps even remove that word altogether and rather call that group of people, and we are all migrants, that's the law of nature, turn it into adventurers or explorers and reduce the usage of the word migrant in totality? That's my question.
Totally agree with you.
Thank you for that. I think everybody could answer that. Yes.
But just to say, I see Gray Wilebinski as a migrant as well, born in the US, living in the UK right now, and I don't know if you showed one of his images, but from this description, migrant or immigrant isn't only necessarily from the Middle East. At least from my perspective, it is not. And I'm sure my colleagues also share that view 100%. But you're right. I think definitions need to just like disappear. But for the sake of the conversation, we're of course using it. But we all believe in the artist. So whenever we're talking about the migrant or the immigrant need, we are actually talking about what the artist needs. We are talking about what the audiences needs. We are talking about like putting that at front and center, but 100% agree with you. Thank you so much for stating that. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the, in a sense, the point you're making is that there is this implied notion that the movement is from a superior place to, from an inferior place to a superior place, like you mentioned, expat. So by redefining or using a different word, maybe we imply better equality. But I'd love Andy to respond as well. I think everyone could respond to that point.
I would just say a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that's something that is important, which is why I've talked broadly about all engaging, not just immigrants. And I often talk about hope, not as a kind of a, hope to strive for a wish. I talk about it as a verb. It's more than just a feel good. I talk about it as action-orientated strength involving agency, motivation, and confidence that the goals will be achieved. And hope is a belief that our future can be better than our past, and that we have a role to play in making of that future into a reality.
Thank you. And Jonathan, finally.
I guess from my perspective, I don't find myself using the terms migrant or immigrant really day to day at all, and I think it's back to kind of giving the artist maker agency. It's understanding how that artist maker wants to talk about their own work, and whether there's something specific around kind of cultural heritage within their work that they want to draw public press, wider audience towards, or not. But it's something that we wouldn't kind of we just don't feel I just don't need to go there.
Right. I believe you had the lady next to the gentleman. Oh, right. Okay. Great. Thank you. Well, my own background is in the market, in the art market. And for the purposes of the art market, artists are defined with a country connection, or sometimes they themselves express a preference. And my world being the Middle East, we have artists who prefer to be, oddly enough, in Middle Eastern sales because they're more recognized by their own buying group, rather than being in the mainstream day sales or evening sales at auction houses, because then they're the small fish in the big pond, whereas in their own group they may be the big fish in the small pond. So there's all of that dynamic at play as well. And all of the naming and defining and all of that is a very, very big conversation, which unfortunately we don't have time today to address, but there is another question. Yes.
Thank you. Just Roxane, just actually a comment about your last remark. I am a Syrian artist, and actually I really deliberately try not to play that card, because it is quite you don't need only to be having this one identity.
Yes.
We have many identities. Yes. You don't want to play that card just because of that, therefore you should be accepted. I feel that is definitely, I try not to go through the auction houses and try not to go for the places where I sell my work for my people. I prefer to be maybe it's a very pretentious word, but actually I prefer to speak to the much more readings rather than just one reading.
Yes,
so
a global community, absolutely.
Yes, this is my comment to last your remark. But thank you very much. If I may just say, not giving a compliment, but I thoroughly enjoyed your conversation and your sensitivity, and I just felt that this is a very nurturing place. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time, so over to Lucy.
That was a lovely comment to end on, so thank you so much to that. So please join me in thanking Roxane, Jonathan, Bengi and Andy for that really superb panel.